Hello and welcome to WNHH FM Radio, Dateline, New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make the Elm City tick. Frank Ricci makes New Haven tick on and off stage. Off stage, he's a captain in the New Haven Fire Department and president of the New Haven Firefighters Union. On stage these days, Frank is a character in a play called Good Faith, or chats about race in the New Haven Fire Department. And I saw it last night. I would say race in class. We'll get to that. It officially opens Thursday night at the Yale Repertory Theater. It's about a Supreme Court case that has Frank's name on it, about affirmative action in government hiring, and Frank has seen the play. So he's pulled up a critic's chair and a fact-checker chair and joined us in the WNHH studio to tell us how it went, and thanks to Yale New Haven Hospital for providing support for today's program. So Frank Ricci, firefighter, named plaintiff in Ricci versus the Stefano, the U.S. Supreme Court case that changed the rules for affirmative action in hiring in municipal departments. You went to the Yale Repertory Theater and you watched the play in which you're one of the main characters. To my surprise, the number 2 character, not the number 1 character, which did surprise me. And so, Frank, how was the play? And if you get close to the mic, I'd appreciate it.
Well, Paul, thanks for having me on today. And if we could start with the fact-checking part real quick.
Actually, could we get a little? Well, wait a little for that?
You demoted me.
Okay.
I'm a battalion chief.
Oh, I'm sorry. And I didn't. And last night I learned that battalion chief is ahead of captain. I always thought captain was the top.
And then, just as a premise, the case, the Ricci case, the New Haven 20 case, wasn't an affirmative action case. It was a Title VII case for the Civil Rights Act, and it was also brought as a 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause case.
The reason I call it an affirmative action case, because you're totally right about the legal term of art, is it more generally is about whether people of color should get special opportunities for advancement to get hired in government, and what the rules should be for when that happens. That's the big debate we've been having in our country.
See, my understanding of affirmative action is when you have 2 people that are essentially equally qualified, if there's an affirmative action plan, they use it to tip the scales where they're considering race when 2 people are equally qualified.
And I would argue that that is the way you and I think it should work, and that was the original idea of how it should work, and that it got a lot more complicated in practice, which is why we ended up having Ricci versus the Stefano. Let's agree to disagree.
We'll agree to disagree. Fair enough.
And I think in the end we're going to agree that it had to do with a lot more than affirmative action. How was the play?
I'd kind of have to bifurcate it. Was it directed well? Yes. I think Kenny Leon did a great job directing it. I was very disappointed in the writing. And essentially, I thought we were going to be presented 4 conversations about race. But if you're going to have a conversation about race, that's the most divisive topic in American politics today. If it's going to be an honest conversation, you have to start off by being honest. And the premise of the play in those conversations, a lot of the foundation was based off misinformation and political rhetoric instead of the facts of what really happened.
So the reason I can't judge that, Frank, is because I went to see this play, and I saw it as someone who has covered this case and lives in New Haven. So I think I understood a lot of nuances that I was just wondering how other audiences would understand it. And even I, who wrote about the case, every time I write about it, I have to go back and restudy the difference between disparate impact and disparate treatment, which was the key issue in the case. So you said it was, but so I couldn't tell if it was misinformation. I mean, there were a few facts I knew were off, but so tell me overall. So you were disappointed. You were a main character. You were sitting in the audience and you were watching yourself be portrayed by an actor named Ian Bedford, who I found out is similar to your height. When I was watching it, I thought, that guy's a lot taller and broader shouldered than Frank. And I knew you informed me today that's a Brooklyn accent he had. I knew it wasn't a New Haven accent. So you had a different accent from yourself. Did you feel like you were watching yourself? Did you feel like you were fairly portrayed?
Paul, to be completely honest with you, I'm somebody who thrives on adversity. If you're going to be in a leadership position, you have to make those hard decisions. So that's a natural place for me to be. But watching somebody portray you on stage was a surreal experience. And it was hard to take it all in because race is such a sensitive issue in America, as it should be. I was a little on edge saying, is this individual going to say something that's taken out of context? or is he going to say something that's just blatantly racist, which is not in my heart?
And you're sitting there with no control.
No control.
Now, when
at
you're
all.
quoted in a paper, you give up some control. You hope that you're going to convince a reporter to portray it the way you want, which you're pretty good at, Frank. You make your case well to a reporter to understand where you're coming from. Doesn't mean you're always going to like the way it comes out. But you had zero control. You're sitting there watching someone be Frank Ricci to the world. And so how did he come off?
And you can't say anything. So I'm sitting there with my wife and my son. So it's not like you could interrupt the play. So my leg was shaking.
I never said that.
Yeah, I can't yell out. I never said that. So that was it was very interesting. I noticed right off the bat, and my wife noticed the Brooklyn accent. And I wonder if I never met the actor, so I wonder if that's his actual accent or whether that was one of the nuances.
Mm-hmm.
Being on the national stage for so many years, I understand the nuance in messaging, and there was a couple things that I noticed. She was fair, I'd say almost 90% with my words.
You know what's so funny about that? I came out of that saying she was fair to Frank about 90% of what he says. Like I felt until the end I got the fair Frank.
I do too.
On the words.
On the words.
But I felt there was a key time I didn't, but we'll get to that.
But one of the things that my father taught me is that it's not only what you say, it's how you say it, and it's also what you don't say.
Yeah.
If you compare Mike Briscoe's character with Frank Ricci's character, you'll see that Mike's character, when he's talking, after he makes a point, he has that pause, that silence, where my character kind of said what I was saying, but it almost ran together.
Right. So I actually have a lot more specifics about that, and we'll get to the key scene. The really key scene is the last scene when you and Mike Briscoe confront each other. And there really are some very positive, I think, ways that's written. But that's where I felt I didn't get totally fair Frank Ricci, and there were a few cheap shots there. But yeah, there was that conversation. And by the end, Mike Briscoe is an African-American firefighter who had his own lawsuit, clearly became the voice of the playwright about who she thought was right, which she has a right to do as a playwright. She admits from on the record there and here that she came into this siding with the black firefighters. And she agrees, and I think that's true too. She had her mind open talking to Frank Ricci and Karen Torrey, the lawyer. So she saw it in a broader way. And she came away feeling both sides really had legitimate arguments, and I think that came into play. In the broader issue of race and policy, she clearly still sided with Mike Briscoe's view, which I think she has a right to do. But then there were little ways she presented it. I'm going to add some to your examples at the end that really made it. I think you can be a person, tell me if you agree with this, who sat in that audience and came away and thought you could fairly hear Frank Ricci's and Karen Torrey's arguments, the arguments of the New Haven 20 firefighters who sued to have the results affirmed of a promotional exam where they did better. You could watch that play and be convinced by your side because those arguments are fairly presented. But that in the end, the scales were tipped so that the playwright's view was that of Michael Briscoe. Is that a fair way to put it?
I agree. But one of the mechanisms she did to arrive there was she put out misinformation. There's two major things that can't escape because they're the foundation of the play. The first one was she put forward that the union was in charge, and this is the only time during this presentation that I'm speaking as the union president. She put forth that the union was somehow involved in background checks. Background checks are not a permissible subject of bargaining. The union had nothing to do with background checks.
Oh, you're talking about whether you have someone's credits. That was one key thing where black firefighters told her they felt it was unfair that all of a sudden they started including credit checks in background, and they talked about how there are circumstances in your life where it has nothing to do with whether you'll be a good firefighter, but you might be more likely to have bad credit, like if your mother was on welfare and kind of use your name to get something. I didn't think, Frank, that she said the union was in charge. I thought she said that the black firefighters felt that a white-led union allowed that and didn't fight for them on that.
The problem is the whole basis is a lie because, to the best of my knowledge, not one firefighter has ever been disqualified because of their credit check. So it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
But is it true that the union did not fight to not have that instituted? Because this is partly about perception. She was on both sides. She was telling why people feel resentful about how they were treated, right?
The background check, that play was the first time I've ever heard the issue, because the background checks aren't used to disqualify somebody on the basis of race or socioeconomics. The reason that any fire department or police department, for that reason, does a credit check is not to see if you were late on paying a bill. They do it so they make sure that you're not putting an extra A or E at the end of your name to avoid your criminal background check. They do it to see if you're driving a $100,000 car and you're only making $20,000 a year. So that credit check in other fire departments and police departments is just to get a group of questions to ask the applicant.
So as I understand your point, I don't think that's a factual error, because she didn't say the union was responsible for it. She said black firefighters felt that the white-led union should have fought not to allow that.
But again, the premise of how you put that forward was that individuals who happen to be black are being disqualified because they were late on paying a bill. And to my knowledge, in the history of the entire fire department and police department in New Haven, no one's ever been disqualified because of a bad credit check.
And what's the other point that you thought was fundamental?
The other fundamental point that wasn't answered is, and this was the thing, they kind of let Frank Ricci talk up there for the New Haven 20, but then
and Karen,
but they didn't let me answer Mike's specific charges, and that was done intentional. So Mike's premise is that the weights were discriminatory in some capacity. But
by weights, let me just let her, and I don't understand this stuff. You always teach me this stuff. I think what you meant by weights, Frank, was that when he's talking about on a test, 40% of your score came from how you did on the oral portion, and 60% on the written. And this was separate from the New Haven 20 case. He had his own case where he said that he felt that was unfair because minorities disproportionately do poorly on the written versus the oral, and that now it has been changed.
Okay, that's misinformation again. Okay, so let me just step back just for our listeners. To have Mike be the voice against the New Haven 20 was a little disjointed because Mike's lawsuit didn't occur until after the New Haven 20 won. Mm-hmm. So we went through years and years of litigation back and forth. Mike Briscoe wasn't a factor until after we prevailed at the United States Supreme Court. That's number one. Number two is, let's take Mike's argument on its face. 60% written, he's saying, is discriminatory against blacks. But what's remiss is, in the Supreme Court record, in Kennedy's decision, but also in Judge Haight's decision to throw out the Briscoe case, Judge Haight does something interesting. He changes the weights. And when he changes the weights, and I wrote them down because my dyslexia will mess them up, just so that, and this will be quick and clear. So at weighting the written test at 60% and the oral at 40, 3 individuals who happen to be African-American would get promoted off the New Haven 20 list. Okay, everybody agrees on that. However, if we flip it and we put 40% written and 60% oral, lo and behold, only 3 African-Americans get promoted. But let's get crazy. Let's say we weight it at 30% for the written and 70% for the oral. Wow, 3 African-Americans get promoted. And now let's take Mike Briscoe's case, which is absurd. You need to have a command knowledge of the skills, knowledge, and abilities of a firefighter. You need to know books because you can't, there's no time to look up in a book when you go to an emergency scene. So you need a base of knowledge. If we weighted the New Haven test 100% and threw out the written test that he says was discriminatory and he says wasn't job related, guess how many minorities are still promoted? 3 qualified African Americans. And that's why his case didn't prevail. And that's why the Board of Aldermen had issues with his settlement, because they were settling a case he lost. It was a garbage lawsuit.
You're talking about stuff that our listeners might not follow. After New Haven 20 won their case about the promotional test, Mike Briscoe, as an African-American firefighter, had a separate case saying that the way the tests were done were unfair to African-Americans. He lost on appeal. Then he stopped his appeal when he got a new job in the city as the 911 chief. And we're talking about good faith. That's the name of a play about 4 chats about race in the New Haven Fire Department at the Yale Repertory Theater. We're talking with Frank Ricci. who was one of the main characters in the play, not only in the lawsuit, but in the play, and he went and watched himself. So overall, how did you feel? Did you like the play, and did you like the Frank Ricci who was on stage?
To be honest, I didn't have time to digest it because I was so worried about what
Yeah.
the actor was going to say. So I am going back the 7th so I could kind of take
I
it
am
in
too.
more.
Yeah.
Oh,
Now,
terrific.
what did your wife and son think?
My wife is more intelligent than I am, and she picked up on every little detail before, and she has a command of the legal issues and of also the case. So she's like, they're building the foundation of the play on misinformation. So,
And what did your son think? Because I want to see what do you feel about Dad? 'Cause I'm sure you're his hero. What do you think about how his dad was portrayed on stage?
my son is quite the character, and one thing that he's been telling the family is he's going to stand up in the play if it's bad and say I was adopted. So he said I was portrayed in a positive light, but he doesn't understand all the nuances of the play. But as he's getting more educated into actually what happened, you got to remember he was, I think, 5 years old when we filed the lawsuit, so he grew up in it, but he didn't know all the details of the Briscoe case because it was filed after we won.
So could I tell you my reaction to the Frank character?
I would love to hear it.
Okay, so I had interviewed the playwright Karen Hartman, and I found out that she and I approach this in a very similar way. That both of us are sort of liberal Yale-educated people who have an outlook on the world that's very different from yours. And Karen Torrey's about race and politics. You're a Trump guy. I'm a Bernie Sanders guy. There's overlap for sure, but you know. But when I researched the story, I was blown away by what I learned from you and Karen Torrey. And I've always thought affirmative action, those kind of issues are very complicated anyway. But I felt this was a case where there were great arguments on both sides that really called to the question about the limits of government policy and unintended consequences. Similar to the way with school desegregation, it's a great goal to want to have schools that aren't segregated, but when you try to fix it, you can make it worse. And I'm thinking about the way after Sheff versus O'Neill ordered to segregate schools in Connecticut, we created regional magnet schools to try to have these formulas of black and white students next to each other, which a lot of black families think isn't important. And in the end, limited opportunities of African Americans. We closed the school in New Haven because Hamden and West Haven black families couldn't get in. They had to have white families picked over them to get the exact percentage of seats that the formula was, which was, again, well-intentioned liberals would do worse by it. Or in there's a school in Hamden, Frank. This blew my mind. Shepherd Glen, where you have maybe the most integrated school on the planet. It's almost a quarter white, a quarter black, a quarter Asian American, and a quarter Latino. Because the formula for school segregation in the state says that you have to have a certain percentage of white students that can't be too much higher than what the percentage is in the student population at large. In other words, if it's like, 50% of, I forget the exact number of your school district population is white, it can't be more than like 61%. So it wasn't exactly 25, 25, 25, 25. It was like, 23.6 or something of the white. They had to close the school because on grounds that it was segregated because segregation was defined as white and not white. So I felt that this case was like that. I mean, you have some great points on the facts, which was that black people didn't get promotions because of this case for many years who would have gotten them if you had actually let the test results go through. But on the bigger point, too, there was this great debate that I think she mostly did a very good job in capturing, in which emerges in a final climactic scene with you and Mike Briscoe having a face-to-face. That Frank Ricci of the New Haven 20 and Mike Briscoe, who was a Firebird and had from another perspective his gray suit. And I felt like you were debating that larger issue about how do you have fairness and opportunity, and how do you have a race-blind society. I felt like your argument was you have to look at the individual so that no individual, you can't have a policy that in the end limits any individual's opportunity, including that of a white person who played by the rules and studied hard and just did better. It might be years after a lot of injustices in the system that people got certain places, but you both studied, you did better. And Mike Briscoe's case was that racism is a system. It exists because of policies and a large system intentions done through policy, whether slave policy. He went back. I mean, he gave this incredible speech by the end where I felt like it was a combination of Martin Luther King and Alan Dershowitz, was legal scholarship and civil rights law, where he's talking about how systems put in place and policies are what historically held people back, so you have to solve it through systems and policies. And again, when you get to specifics, most of us would agree in the end that it was kind of stupid how it played out to stop this test, and black people don't get promoted. And now you have, because of that test, black leadership in the department. On this larger question is a very good debate. And I felt in that final scene, as I said, people could listen to both of you and come out one side or the other. And while I have opinions on it, I don't think my opinions matter. I think it's a really genuine, honest debate that isn't always right on one side or the other. But I think little things were done in that scene to present you as wrong and him as right. That didn't happen in the rest of the play. In the first scene, we see Frank and we love Frank. I mean, Frank is teaching this class and he's like a TV character, a class on fire safety. He's funny. He knows so much about fires and he tells you why they're important and how you fight them, but he does it in plain English with jokes about yellies who drank too much or stuck on East Rock, right? Or make you want to cry for the firefighter lost his life because someone knocked too many windows out. I mean, you say, oh my God, this guy's like a freaking hero. And Mike Briscoe, you see him with some flaws. You have this hilarious conversation with this great other black firefighter character who turns out to be sympathetic to New Haven 20 and doesn't like Planned Parenthood. And you know, Mike says interesting things, but he also mangles the language a little bit, and he's vain and this kind of stuff. But in that final scene, it's almost like a Hollywood movie from the 40s where the spotlight goes on the heroic character, whether it's Humphrey Bogart or Jimmy Cagney, who makes this money speech that the playwright had ready about society. And even though you're allowed to present your argument well, every time Mike Briscoe has a good point, and the playwright is on stage with him watching it, you then stare at your computer and you don't pay attention.
Correct.
And you use their words put in your mouth. I want to ask whether they're accurate or not, that people on our side of the debate often point to when we think the other side's being racist. You call him a kid 3 times. You call a grown man who's black a kid 3 times. Did you really call him a kid?
I don't remember.
Okay.
It was recorded, but...
Well, she said she did not use transcripts. She recorded and she used some of the transcript and she wrote other stuff in. And when you have a transcript, you're only using 1% of the transcript, so you're picking your words. So if you really said kid, she deliberately picked that to show that. If you didn't say kid, she put a racist word in your mouth 3 times.
I don't recall.
The second thing is you called him articulate. Now, if you spend your time reading the Daily Caller, you read about all the liberal hypocrites and things they say that make them look bad. If you read the left-wing sites and civil rights sites that I read, you read about how white people always call black people articulate, and it's condescending. The assumption being that white people are articulate, black aren't. I'm just saying that that's a code word.
I don't believe. I use the word articulate all the time to describe many people. To me, that's not a code word.
But anyway, that's why that was in there.
I also make it clear that Mike's articulate, but he also has circular logic. And if you
you disagree with what he said,
right? But if
I'm
you
just saying
to
to Frank
that's
the reason that's in there. The way that word articulate was planted, the way the word kid was to make a point, which is that whatever the merits of the 2 arguments are, Frank is racist. And then so you're looking. Did you look at the computer and ignore him when he made his great points?
I don't think he was making great points.
He made his main points. You made your money points. He was staring at you and responding. He made his money points. You made your best case for that big argument. He listened, she listened. He made his best case for that argument. You ignored him and looked at your computer while she watched Wrapped, and the center of the stage was on him and everyone's eyes.
And I think that's what she was trying to put forward. If during that interview I looked at my computer, it would be because he hit the point of his circular logic where he started contradicting himself. So at some point in that long interview, did I look at the computer? I probably did. And
of course, the clincher was.
But I think it was intentional the way they
you
took
choose
me out
what
of
you put
the
there.
argument.
I'm saying that these are 4 things I noticed that even though I do feel the words you spoke were fair, it gave your side, the staging tilted the scale, which he's allowed to do.
And I agree.
And the 4th one was, after you guys made your big arguments, you ask him how to spell the word loose. The idea being that this guy who didn't prevail with power, who's black, is in the room with the white guy whose side won. They've made the big arguments. And now it's the white guy who can't spell the word loose who's asking the black guy, how do you spell it? You know what I'm talking about?
I know exactly what you're talking about.
So did that happen?
I don't recall. I could tell you this. Spell check is not my friend because I spell the word so wrong it comes up as another word. So, that's the
way I saw it, Frank.
Right.
I thought that she tried very hard, the way I try as a reporter to keep my biases out. Nobody ever succeeds at that. We just try our best. And that in the words she wrote to have you people say she succeeded, and at the key moment in the way she staged it and what she left in and out, she tipped the scale against you.
And I agree. And that was my wife's first impression right off the bat.
And then the other key things in substance, tell me if this is factually right. Then the sort of revelation is, the question is, why didn't he do well on the test? The revelation presented by the playwright is the night before he was forced to work in emergency duty, so he got no sleep, and all the white people were allowed not to. Is that accurate?
I don't know whether he got no sleep or not, but I know that individuals who were committed to taking that test, a lot of them made sure that they got special leave, just like when a firefighter needs to see a basketball game for his kid or a baseball game. You can get individuals to work for you. Individuals took vacation. And the fact of the matter is, there was a couple other things that just were blatantly not true.
Like what?
The captain wouldn't let him study. In fact, one of our lieutenants on our shift, who happened to be Hispanic, who ended up scoring and would have made the rank of captain. One of the things that he did for the whole entire shift is during the study period, if there was a department drill, because the material was so job related, he would use the very material as the drill for the day. And Mike didn't have a command over the subject. So that was the basis of why I was saying he wasn't studying. And he was selling mortgages or refinancing mortgages out of the firehouse. People would come in the firehouse and he would do mortgage paperwork with them. He didn't apply himself. It wasn't some broad or some like assertion on my part. We saw that he didn't have a command of the subject because he wasn't applying himself.
I'm a little hesitant to get into the pros and cons of Mike because I invited him. I couldn't reach him, and he's not on the show to defend himself.
Yeah,
on
and
that.
I wish he comes on the show.
Because I hope to get him again. And, I've had an interesting experience with Mike, and I saw him in a new light. I always thought Mike was an intelligent person for sure. I think I had never heard him speak the way he did in that play. But the way I've known him as a reporter, I've given him a hard time. So he ran the 911 emergency center. He had a dispute with his ex-wife, and there were some calls that were mishandled. And I was hard on him. And he always was a gentleman with me. He always gave me his side. I made him nervous because I made his life difficult. And I always felt I respected him very much in how he dealt with me. So I never got to see the side that's presented in the play that obviously the playwright experienced. I always knew he was intelligent. I didn't know he was this historical theorist and legal theorist who had such a command, as you do, on the history of the law and the case. You guys were citing the rulings in depth. He went back to the Amistad case and how civil rights law developed since the Civil War. And I just thought that was this thing. I never saw that. I don't know.
Mike is always polite, and he always has a great demeanor about him. So I would never take that away from him in any capacity.
And we're not taking away from anyone. We're just here on Dateline New Haven, WNHH FM, 103.5 FM. We're talking about the play of the season at the Yale Rep, Good Faith. 4 chats about race in the New Haven Fire Department with Frank Ricci, one of the main characters. So you're going to go back. Are you kind of glad you did it? You spent a lot of time with the playwright. Do you think she, in general, listened to you, and are you glad you spent the time with her?
Absolutely. And this is a lesson in politics and being an American. We have to talk to each other, and we have to communicate. I knew what angle she was coming on, coming into this with, and I knew it was going to be slanted with the leftist view. But I figured if I could just move the narrative a little bit to bring it more to that honest conversation, then I figured it'd be a victory.
See, I always felt as a journalist that we shouldn't pretend that reporters aren't liberal in general. We shouldn't pretend that rich newspaper owners aren't conservative in general. That we should just be upfront with people about our bias and then try really hard to listen to them and have everyone presented fairly.
That's why you're considered a great journalist.
No, but that's why it sounds like you in general felt that your view was fairly presented, just that you were personally misrepresented.
I would say that's a fair statement.
But you don't regret it.
No, I don't regret it. In the great philosopher of the 20th century, the only thing worse than them talking about you is them not talking about you.
They spelled your name right.
They spelled my name right.
I actually end up spelling people's name wrong a lot, and it really gets me upset. So I thought the play brilliantly captured one character. I want to know if you think the same thing. John DeStefano appears for 3 words, the former mayor of New Haven at the time. He steps on the stage for 20 seconds. I don't want to tell you what it is because some people might see the play and I don't want to surprise them. Did you agree with me that that I covered John DeStefano for 26 years, like pretty intensely? I felt like that was the best accurate portrayal of what John DeStefano was like I have ever seen.
I hate to admit it, but I think I missed it. because I wasn't sure who he was playing when he first came
It was
out.
the same
Because
actor who played you.
It's
And I
the
actually
same
think
actor.
he was more like you. Now, what about this actor? Now, here's a case where the play did make me, I guess that makes it successful, made me think of the case and about you a little differently. So I said to my wife, I said, I never can see what people look like. It's weird for a reporter. I can't tell you what color your clothes are. I'm colorblind, but it's not just because of that. When my wife says I meet someone, I can't tell if they're tall, short, fat, or skinny unless they're obese or, real thin. I can't tell what color their hair was if they had glasses, but I could tell them if they're kind of like a Ted Cruz conservative or if they're kind of like think society should use government to solve problems or not. I'm kind of that head in the clouds guy. And I said, I really don't think Frank is this big, beefy guy.
I don't think I am.
Right, but I thought you were shorter than I was, which I'm wondering if that was condescending. Because I always thought of you as scrappy. Like the guy who's the underdog who just punches above his weight by studying a little harder and just not letting up. But then you walked in today and I realized we're about the same height.
We are about the same height.
But you don't look like that guy.
But I think it was also intentional that they casted somebody who, while I'm losing my hair today, they casted somebody who was completely bald.
Oh, they wanted a physically imposing, tough white guy with the Brooklyn accent. What about the Brooklyn accent?
My father was from Brooklyn, but I'm about as far from Brooklyn as can be. I was born in New York, but I grew up in Connecticut, so I don't think I portray that.
And so let me ask you this: NHFD. You work for the NHFD.
Yes.
What does the NHFD stand for?
New Haven Fire Department.
New Haven Fire Department.
Yes.
Not the New Haven Fire Department. New Haven Fire Department.
I guess so. I'm missing something here.
My biggest critique of the play is that the whole play pronounced New Haven as New Haven. The playwright lived in New Haven for, I think, 6 years. But she came at this from the perspective of someone who is trying to understand New Haven that she doesn't understand. And I find this isn't to put people down. This is always fight what's a genuine New Havener. Like, I've been here 40 years. I raised my kids here. I actually grew up here because I didn't grow up till I was much older than most people are when they grow up, and I still haven't fully. But I'm not considered a real New Havener from people who grew up here and had that experience. So I've been here from 18 to 58 years old.
Okay.
But yet I consider myself a New Havener compared to other people. And the way I do that is based on how they pronounce the city.
Paul, I think you are New Haven.
But in any case, when you say New Haven, I think, and maybe this is overanalyzing, I think there's a real condescension. I think it's like a sort of respect that New Haven's gritty, an exaggeration of how gritty, like those savage people who like are kind of violent, which isn't true. And it's almost a patting of a head. Because I think the playwright tried very hard not to be that way and to respect the people she portrayed, which she did with you and Karen for the most part. But to keep calling it New Haven, and then there's this line that slips in where someone says New Haven's beautiful, Connecticut's beautiful, and the playwright looks shocked. And the assumption is that New Haven's an ugly place and kind of a backwater.
And it's far from an ugly place.
It's beautiful. You're thinking about our parks and our architecture.
Everything is in
green and
everything's in New Haven.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a beautiful place, but it's that view from outside that I think led to why she tried so hard to be fair to people she didn't agree with. And I think, although she succeeded in some of the theoretical big ways, that way she portrayed that last scene was such a slip up. I agree. And I think it comes down to New Haven. I think that when people talk about New Haven, there's almost this assumption they understand it from above. And to write a whole play, we spent 6 years living here and 4 years hanging out with all these people, I'm sure none of whom say New Haven. That's just so fundamental to me. I don't know.
New Haven is unbelievable. We love the city. We love the citizens we serve. And New Haven has it all. And even if for the individuals that live in the suburbs, I like to say everybody's a citizen of Rome, because whether this is where they take their kids to the hospital, this is where they get culture. If they're putting fuel in their car, it comes from our deep water port. And the city is the lifeblood of the suburbs, and this is the cultural center. And I love New Haven.
And by the way, I don't care about convincing people who don't want to be here to live here. I always thought that was a failed strategy of the 80s and 90s. We're strong because of who wants to be here and what's so great about the place. And we don't have to convince people who don't want to live in a place like this or work here to come here. I think the reason we've succeeded in the last 10 years is we changed our whole strategy. We didn't try to be like the suburbs,
No, we should be different because New Haven is different, and that's what makes it so great. Is there's a little bit of everything. It's like all of New York City in one very small place.
Yeah. So when you had this climactic argument with Briscoe, did you really have that in person the same way? Like, what do you remember about that meeting when you went to each other's office?
It was a long, drawn out meeting. So it lasted, to me, it lasted a long amount of time. But talking to Mike Briscoe is always easy to talk to Mike Briscoe. I have had a relationship with him for over 20 years, and we've always been what I would consider friends. So I see him at events, I see him out. So it was natural. She made it like it was a big deal. Now maybe that was just because
But
of
it
drama.
sounds like it was hard for him after. I mean, they're in the car. And I believe that part where he said it's because I've seen him in other situations of stress where he's trying his hard to do something and then needing to kind of decompress because it was emotionally hard. I think it was hard for him.
Well, possibly that could be it. But as John Adams says, facts are stubborn things. And sometimes Mike ignores the facts.
Okay. All right. The other big takeaway in one play I thought the play succeeded was to have me think about the issues in a new way. So the climactic scene, I don't want to give away too much to people, is when you and Mike Briscoe have this big argument about what are the specifics of what really happened to the test, but also how do we address fairness and opportunity in society. And believe it or not, Frank, it's going to blow your mind. I thought of the famous debates between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And the reason I thought about that is that in society, when we're dealing with tough issues, we often have people who stand because of a debate they've had for the different sides of the issue, as though they're the opposites. So Malcolm X was seen as the opposite of Martin Luther King, who preached nonviolence, although we all forget how white people were scared of Martin Luther King this day. Now he's considered everyone's hero. And Malcolm X was seen as the violent guy because he said we should do it by any means necessary. In reality, Martin Luther King would not have believed you had a gun in his face and he had a gun and you're about to pull a trigger that you shouldn't pull out your gun and shoot back. Malcolm X did not believe you should go and just beat up people you disagreed with. It was a very nuanced discussion in which they had as much common ground as uncommon. When I finished watching Frank, quote unquote, Frank Ricci, arguing with Mike, quote unquote, Mike Briscoe, I felt like it was the same kind of conversation. You had honest disagreements about the facts of your two lawsuits. You have honest disagreements about this big issue about we best create opportunity for people like firefighters by starting with looking at every individual and making that no individual gets an unfair treatment, versus do you have to start by looking at systems that have historically discriminated and systems and policies that have to change. Great issue. You two would vote differently on those. What I came away with was, as in the other discussion, you had so much more in common than not, that even though this is very much about race, it's also about class. And that in some ways you're talking about different means to an end, the same end, that when you actually get the specifics you would agree with. You know, at one point in that he agrees with you about your whole lawsuit.
Yes, he does.
And that he agrees, and that we all agree that in the end, black people got promoted from that list, and now black firefighters and Latinos run the department. So that's what I came away with. It's kind of interesting. So I guess a feather in a cap there.
As I said, Mike always has circular logic, and it comes back in the end. But yes, he said in one breath in his suit that the test was not job related, but then he supported us getting promoted. So a lot of his positions are at war with each other. And when you look at just the facts or his own writings or the representations his lawyer makes, they don't hold water. And that's one of the problems. But I think we all need to be able to agree to disagree on some things. But I think as Americans, we fail when we put people into racial categories without looking at the individuals. Mm-hmm. The equivalent for the listeners for the New Haven 20 case that I think everybody could understand would be high school graduation rates have disparate impact. The answer to the problem is, and I think we would all agree, is better education.
I think one way we'd agree, I was thinking when I was watching the play, where's a place Frank and I would agree that the place to really take the steps to boost opportunity, because you were talking about the difference between an entrance test versus a promotion test,
which is
there's a huge difference. And that it's even earlier, that the way you really create better opportunities at the very earliest ages with education.
Correct. The key to diversity, which is a laudable goal, is education. The way the city wanted to fix the problem on the fire department and socially engineer the fire department it would be the answer of saying, well, try again next year. We're not going to let anybody graduate this year. And that's where the crux of the issue is. You got to look at people as individuals.
Mm-hmm. And do you often go to plays?
No. At least, well, I was kind of hoping I would start singing or something. So, no. I've been to musicals. I've never been to a play where people just talk. So it was an interesting experience.
You just brought up the other major point I want to break about decisions she made. You were hoping someone would start singing. You were kind of joking a little bit there. You were saying you were hoping it was a little more fun to watch. She made a decision to deal with these issues through conversations. Now, in the second act, there is some action in how she and Karen Torrey went on a boat, how you and Mike acted when you're in a room or when they were at the Greek Holiday. But in general, it's about having the conversation as a conversation. We actually get lectures in this from a law professor about the nitty-gritty of this case. We actually have many speeches about what are the issues and how to interpret it. If this were Hollywood doing it in the 50s or 40s, in the 40s especially when there were a lot of communist directors who were trying to get certain themes out, they didn't have speeches like that until the very end. It was always Jimmy Cagney or Humphrey Bogart in the end would make some big speech about what this all means. But they did the ideas all through what happens day to day in action. If you're talking about, like, what's the right way to treat people, it would be done through a story about how someone's mother treated them or the kid that got in the fight or a murder that happened. So now she made a decision. She's dealing with one of the most dramatic professions you can imagine, firefighting. And except for when Frank Ricci's in the training academy described what it's like to go in a fire with a still photograph, you're not actually seeing any firefighting. You're not seeing any action. Now, on the one hand, and I'm not a playwright, Frank, honestly, so I feel like I'm out a little above my pay grade here. I was saying, well, if I wrote it, if I could be a playwright, I would have called it trial by fire, and I would have had the fire take place in a courtroom. And I would have had showing how firefighters deal with each other and about how people who have always had racial group animosities also live and eat and work together and have and face death together. Show it rather than talk about it, so that I might still have that scene at the end where you two give your speech pretty in the words, not in the portrayal, the good arguments on both sides. I would have shown what firefighting is like to make the point about how this has to do with a much more complicated questions about human beings and opportunity and how they relate, rather than have a law professor describe disparate impact and disparate treatment, rather than have recitations of the case. Now, some people would say she took the easy way out by having you just talk about it, where it's harder when you're writing a story. That's why good fiction writers are so good. They tell you, they cover truth and big ideas by telling you a story about the way people really act. And that's harder. But other people would say she did the brave thing, where it's harder to get people to sit in an audience and not just sit there like you and me thinking, I wish somebody would sing or break a window or something, right? Show me a story, just talk to me. And I wonder whether you and I are even capable of analyzing it, because we know everyone involved. You were the freaking character. It's like, I know these people up there. I know what's so interesting about Victor Bolden, the city lawyer, that couldn't be said, that he was actually the lawyer for the National NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Black lawyer comes in after a white city lawyer was at war with the New Haven 20 and gets along with them great and respects where they're different and solve the problem.
And I provided testimony for Victor Bolden to become a federal judge.
So I'm saying, I know those nuances, so I kind of got that at this. I was wondering, could you watch this play and even understand it if you're either not from New Haven or you're not a law student?
Well, I think the play was hyper local, but I also agree with you. If she was trying to come in with an open mind, it would have been trial by fire. But instead, she decided to yell fire in a crowded theater because it's race. It's opening up the scabs, the wounds, because people do have in their hearts, there are people that totally disagree with me, and I totally disagree with them, and we have a lot more in common than we have apart. But here, she brought this to New Haven. I thought it was a little irresponsible, but I wanted to participate in it to at least move the narrative. But she brought it to New Haven while all the figures and all the people are still here working, living, and serving the citizens of New Haven. And then she put herself in the play as the vehicle.
But that's what blew my mind covering the case, is that after the case was over, of course, you're Frank Ricci, so every year you got something else you're passionate about and you're in a controversy about. And all of a sudden, the players weren't on the same side. You would have a case where you're with the black firefighters group against another faction of the union that's white. That depending on the issue the team's made, and like when you're covering local news, when the play is over, the big national case is over, it's so much more complicated.
Paul, I have the honor of representing the men and women of the New Haven Fire Department. And to me, they're all blue because that's what we wear. And the fact is, we provide the best service to the citizens of New Haven. hands down, we're the best municipal service.
Well, before I let you go, Frank, and thank you so much for being the critic and the fact checker for good faith. I want to move away from that and go to what you were just talking about. How long has it been since the fire department has had a union contract?
It's been since July of last year, and we're in negotiations right now as we
How
speak.
are those going?
Ask me next week, but I'm not dodging your question.
Yes, you are.
Our issues. No, I'm actually not. We're in negotiations, and our issues are very clear. We want to, and it's mainly for the newer members. Ironically, the city residents. Mayor Harp did a great thing with reaching out to the community to try to get more individuals from the city to apply to be firefighters. But the goal of Mayor Harp to do that very thing was to move individuals into the middle class. I think that's fair to say. But at the same time, right when she finally reached her goal that other mayors failed at, they cut the benefits. So they welcomed her with one hand, shook their hand, welcome, you're a firefighter. And then they slashed the benefits when it comes
For
to
newer hires.
For newer hires, when it comes to their family pension and health care. And even as a conservative, I believe firefighters should be able to retire with dignity. And I believe that health care is important for the fire service.
Now
so we're working to try to fix some of those inequities.
So are they seeking concessions for newer firefighters?
No, right now we're trying to bring up the newer firefighters.
So they already had a two-tier system of benefits.
Correct.
Where newer firefighters, it's like in the police department, if you're hired after a certain date, you can retire after 25 years. Before it was 20. So last contract had some of those concessions. You're trying to get them back?
Correct, but the concessions were, you have ebbs and flows in contracts based off economic factors. That's just a fact of life. But what happened in our last contract wasn't the normal ebb and flow. I call it generational robbery because it was so drastic. So I'm going to give you an example for our listeners. They took overtime out of the newer members, and this is almost 50% of our department now. They took overtime out of their pension. And a lot of individuals, especially conservatives, can say that's fair because we need to make sure the pension is sustainable in the future. I think that's a fair argument. However, not only did they take overtime out of their pension in one shot, they also dropped them 10% on their pension. And they took their wife and kids out of the health care when they retire.
Well, I want to welcome you to the Bernie Sanders left, Frank Ricci, because my feeling has always been the right demonizes public sector unions. It's rightly stated that cities have a problem and state governments now, they can't afford the pensions and health care that they get. So people argue they should have it like the private sector. Our side believes that unions were unfairly weakened in the private sector so that people could no longer get fair wages, health care, and pensions. And that rather than resenting public employees who get pensions and health care that they can retire on and they can afford to get sick, we believe everybody should have that, even if that means raising taxes to pay for it in addition to making government.
That's a long conversation, and we could have that at another time.
But in the nitty-gritty here, you're fighting for that.
I'm fighting for that because that represents the middle class.
How do your older members feel about it?
They're for it.
Because that's the story of American unions, is that they sell out the younger members because the older members, you say it's almost 50% now affected. In general, the way governments get these contracts is they get the union membership leaders to protect the people who've already been there a while, who have the more influence in the union, and just weaken terms for the new people.
It's a strange dichotomy. So I love unions and hate them all at the same time. And you are correct. Unions, the cities put the unions against each other, their members against, divide and conquer, and the unions end up eating their young. And I'm trying to reverse that with the leadership of our e-board now, is we're actually fighting for the newer members to come up to a more realistic scale. We want the city to succeed, but we also have to realize that the men and women in the New Haven Fire Department would make their spouse a widow and their kids parentless for the community we serve, and they do that every day.
Which is why it gets back what I did like about the play. I think it makes you see that these things we fight about nationally in general terms that matter as debates are so much more complicated when you deal with them day to day with real people in your local community, and that there aren't these rigid definitions we think we have. We see each other as people and solving problems. So welcome. Are you supporting Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren for president?
As I said, that's a conversation for another day, Paul.
Okay. Well, I really loved our conversation today. Frank Ricci, Battalion Chief, President of New Haven Fire Union, and the inspiration, though not necessarily the exact copy, of the main character, or one of the main characters in Good Faith Pork chats about race in the New Haven Fire Department at Yale Rep. Frank, thanks so much for coming in. I love when you come in.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
All right. And thanks to Yale New Haven Hospital for providing support for today's program. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience, performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. Now, we know what it's like to be free. We just got to remember to book our flight. Fly free with us all day and all night long here at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.